All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. Today, we mark two related instances of political canine deflection. Two American politicians, FDR and Richard Nixon, who used stories about their dogs to help navigate political crises. And they are related to each other. So the first was in 1944 in a speech by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in which he lashed out at his political critics, but tucked into that speech was an anecdote about his dog, Fala, who had also received some criticism in the press. And that funny and charming anecdote was actually written with the help of Orson Welles, believe it or not, and it made the speech into a hit. And it, in many ways, put FDR back on solid political footing. Now, cut to 8 years later, or 50-some-odd years in dog years, and to the very day, vice presidential candidate Richard Nixon is caught up in a swirl of accusations of his own about improper campaign funding, and he is at risk, actually, of being dropped from the ticket by Eisenhower. And he gives this long speech that includes a charming anecdote about his dog, Checkers. This comes to be known actually as the Checkers speech. It's one of the most significant in American political history, and it's one that kind of saved Nixon's career. So, and moreover, you know, there's obviously the relation between these two speeches and the anecdotes about dogs, but you could maybe even think of these two speeches as a bracket of sorts in American political history. The first signaling the height of FDR New Deal populism, and the second signaling kind of the end of that FDR era and really laying the groundwork, as Nixon does in this speech, for a new type of conservative populism flowing from Nixon to Reagan and beyond. Or maybe they were just two charming stories about dogs. I'll leave it to the historians to see how big think they want to get with this. But let's talk about it with, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello. I have to say, I do like the idea of using Fala and Checkers as a kind of historical periodization. We should always use dogs as the markers for ends and beginnings of eras.
My PhD is in the mail, right?
Should just keep checking that box every day.
Can I just say, this is not a coincidence that I am drinking coffee right now from my black dog mug.
There you go.
So I'm like, the Martha's Vineyard mug.
Let's start there, Niki, as resident both 20th century historian and dog owner and lover. I want to do Checkers first and then go back in time, maybe, unless you feel like. But very quickly, Checkers, Fala, what kind of dogs were they? And if you had to own one of them, which would you own?
So Fala was a Scottie, and Checkers was a Cocker Spaniel, and Nala, my little puppy who is dozing next to me as I speak, is a Havanese poodle mix, or a Havapoo.
A Havapoo. Very nice.
Just sit there with it.
Incredible.
Dog lovers.
So, I will confess, I just feel like the Checkers speech comes up over and over as legendary speeches in American political history. And, I kind of had a rough sense of it, that there was this charming anecdote tucked into this larger thing. But, in digging into this, the first thing I noticed was, my good God, this is a long speech. Incredible. And it's not all dog related, but, and so I think Nixon bridled a bit about the fact that I gave this super long speech that sort of did all these things, and people are just remembering the dog part. But I gotta confess, that was major.
It's a master class in deflection, right? Because if you can get people to talk about or think about, focus on something else, which he does with Checkers so eloquently, by telling this story of how a man in Texas heard them on the radio, and that they were two youngsters that had a dog, and that they wanted to give this dog to him as a gift. And so they meet the little Cocker Spaniel that's in a crate sent all the way from Texas, and it's black and white and spotted. And our little girl, Trisha, was 6 years old at the time and decided to name it Checkers. And like, there's all this like warm, fuzzy feelings about like getting a dog for the first time and what you name it, and how people are so caring, and that becomes what people sink their teeth into.
Yeah, and let's take a step back and talk about why he's talking about this dog to begin with. So Nixon had made a reputation for himself nationally as part of the House Un-American Activities Committee, particularly prosecuting the case of Alger Hiss. And he is named as Eisenhower's running mate in 1952. And no sooner is he named as Eisenhower's running mate than there are these accusations leveled against Nixon that he had a secret political slush fund and he was misappropriating and misusing funds. And this is actually a serious crisis because Eisenhower is like, I do not need this. He was getting ready to dump Nixon from the ticket. And Nixon, in a way, goes over Eisenhower's head directly to the American people on television. And by 1952, millions of Americans have televisions. And Nixon is able to get a half hour of time where he's on this kind of set where he's sitting behind a desk at times, or like standing, sitting next to his wife in this kind of living room / office kind of setting. And he goes through all of his finances on national television in order to make clear that he has not been getting rich off of his political career. And he even talks about how his wife, Pat, she doesn't have a mink coat. She has a respectable Republican cloth coat. And this idea that these are humble people who are not splashing around a lot of wealth. And that's when he says near the end of the speech, I have to admit I did take one political gift, and that political gift was Checkers. And then after that little description, he's like, and whatever they say about it, we're not giving her back.
Yeah. So it's like deflection, but also that, I don't know what the rhetorical name for it is, but the sort of narrowing down towards, well, if I did do something improper, look how cute it was, and the sort of like slight concession, but also just sort of redefining the terms. Like, people probably walked away from that speech being like, well, the accusation is that he took this cute dog or whatever.
Right. He took a dog. He took a dog. Bad is that? And his daughter's probably like, Daddy, can we keep him? And then, who could resist their daughter? It's a great story. But,
a couple other tidbits, and then I think this larger question of kind of the nature of the speech and the impact of the speech. But, we're talking about $18,000 here in the slush fund is really the sort of crux of the amount of money, which not an insignificant amount back then. But, I just think like it's such a marker of, there's so many markers of that era there. That,
right.
$18,000 flowing in a slightly shady way would cause such a scandal. Well, at the same time, I would say, like, clearly Nixon is a slush fund lover from day one. You're just like, yeah, maybe actually there was, should have kind of kept an eye on this guy's secret stashes of money. But also, the fact that like this was happening at a moment of attention span being just so different from it is now, because the length of this speech, but also just the kind of like almost like brutal rhetorical style. So, there's deflection, but there's also, he just sort of drowns the audience in anecdotes and information and circular language. Like, he starts with this whole thing that's kind of like a thought exercise about had he done it, would it have been wrong? And if it had happened, I would say that it's morally wrong and it would be illegal. And then he says, but no, it didn't happen and it's not, but like,
again, masterclass.
But of a time,
spin.
right? If you're giving this speech now, it's kind of like, if you're not telling me exactly what you want to tell me within the first 30 seconds, you've lost the audience. Yeah. And instead here, he just does this kind of like really long, but also just like, because he knows he can hold the audience. But on that sort of stuff you described, Niki, about the coat and his family finances and both the sort of level of detail, but also painting this picture of what I think a lot of people have come to see as like a real style of conservative populism and saying, you know, I am just like
you,
the people struggling. I'm just like you. It really does feel like it lays a blueprint in many ways, and you can see that kind of language all the way through to today.
Absolutely. And it cuts such a contrast to somebody like Eisenhower, who was a larger than life figure. And Nixon brings that kind of modesty to the ticket. It's an interesting parallel to somebody like Harry Truman, who they were following, who himself was a pretty modest president who didn't have a ton of money. So yeah, there is this conservative populism going forward that leans into this idea that we're just like one of you, that you know, we're not wealthy, fancy people. It's not just conservative. I mean, you can see it in somebody like Jimmy Carter as well. Yeah. But definitely Nixon is
but Jimmy
painting
Carter
a
was
picture.
actually poor. Like, actually poor.
Right.
You know, he grew up a peanut farmer. Like,
although Nixon grew up in poverty as well. It's
really?
just,
Okay.
yeah. So he later becomes wealthier through his political career and probably one or two slush funds on the side.
But, you know, and this happens, you know, I mean, it happens on both sides. I mean, John Kerry tried to paint himself, you know, in many ways as a salt. Every
little bit of a stretch there.
Salt of the earth. But, you know, it is remarkable. You know, you look at sort of Republican presidents, and it's like Reagan had to sort of make people forget that he was a really famous, very wealthy movie star. You know, George W. Bush had to like go, you know, weed whack on a ranch in Texas in order to make people forget that he had come from kind of the bluest of bloods. And so, you know, I think that's always been a thing. And you can see those seeds planted here.
Well, and I also think there's a hint of populism in the way he goes about this on television, because what ends up happening is the Eisenhower campaign is flooded with telegrams of people who are like, you cannot dump this man. This is an honest man. You have to keep him on the ticket. And so he's actually using kind of popular will to keep himself on as Eisenhower's running mate, using this new medium of television.
Yeah, because there's reporting that the Eisenhower camp was like really, really close to asking Nixon to actually withdraw from the ticket in this speech. And then this totally changed the narrative.
I mean, the speech is sort of, I guess, Nixon's Hail Mary in some ways. Like, this is like, well, if they're going to let me go, at least let me have my say. At least let me tell my side of the story. And then whether it happens or not, at least I've gotten my piece out there.
Yeah. Okay, so we have this speech in 1952, and it has this story of a dog tucked inside of it. Now, it does appear that the choice to include that anecdote was in part because of someone in Nixon's world knew their political history and thought, just 8 years ago, there was another speech that sort of had a similar vibe of someone trying to recast themselves, and it included a speech about a dog. And so, you know, these are really connected, not just sort of coincidentally, but it really does seem like the Checkers anecdote was inspired by the Fala anecdote. And so let's turn to that. What are the circumstances under which FDR has to go out and give this big speech, and then why does he decide to tell a story about a dog?
This is the craziest scandal in some ways. So it's the middle of World War II. It is the middle of Roosevelt's fourth presidential election campaign. And he had flown out to the Aleutian Islands to do a tour to meet with folks in the U.S. Navy. And Republicans accuse him of leaving behind his little dog, Fala, and then requiring a U.S. Navy destroyer to go out there and to retrieve him at just sort of like over-the-top costs to taxpayers. So here's this profligate waste of taxpayer money because Roosevelt left behind his tiny dog.
This dog that went with him everywhere, and I mean everywhere. It was obviously in the Oval Office, but it was also with him when he met with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Like, everyone sort of knew this dog, which is also kind of funny that he would take the dog absolutely everywhere and then forget about him while leave him on these islands. But of course, the idea of, you know, sparing no expense to retrieve him causes a real kerfuffle.
And so Roosevelt works this into a speech where he talks about the way that Republican leaders not only attack me, they not only attack my family, but now they've attacked my dog. And he's like, it doesn't matter to me. It doesn't matter to my family. But Fala, relying on some ethnic stereotypes, is Scotch and therefore very cheap. So he is furious. In fact, he says that Fala has not been the same dog since.
But
too much.
Am I wrong in my reading here that there isn't like a full-on denial? I mean, he calls it fiction, right? But then he very quickly just makes a joke and says, you know, my dog is upset at all these accusations and so forth. But, you know, I think maybe that was the rhetorical approach, was just like, don't even engage, turn this into a joke, trivialize it as quickly as possible. But there isn't like a straight up, this is not true.
I mean, this goes back to what you said earlier. It's like, but did you or did you not? Like, yes or no? You don't get, I mean, it's the politician's answer, right? You're never going to get a straight yes or no. It's always going to be this long metaphor, this long soliloquy about, you know, some other way of making America great, whatever. You know, like there's always these ways of creating some sort of, again, deflection so that we're not paying attention to money that was spent. We're focused on this other thing that they want us to pay attention to. It's very, you know, a magician's trade.
Yeah. I mean, he says, you know, I, as a dog owner, I have a right to resent to libelous statements about my dog. I mean, you almost expect him to then say, and all you dog owners out there would totally understand that if your dog was left on an island, you would move heaven and earth and you would use every possible, resource at your disposal to go retrieve that dog. And of course, I sent a destroyer to get them. You know, we have to fight our way in. No, it doesn't say that. But you know, it's kind of playing with that, and I don't know. Maybe the dog owner demographic is large enough to swing an election. But yeah.
Well, and I also just think the humor won so many people over. The people who were in the room were laughing and they were cheering and hooting and hollering. But this was also carried on radio, so people back home in their living rooms listening along were also chuckling to this story, and it diffuses, as you were saying, Jody, even without like this explicit angry denial. It diffuses the accusation, and of course has little effect on Roosevelt's re-election.
Oh God, I know.
Orson Welles. So it really is the case that Welles was a Roosevelt supporter and campaigned for him, and then would occasionally just sort of send him bits and lines and stuff to use. Welles, I think, was self-effacing in this and said kind of like, he uses my material in all the speeches that don't matter. But in here, really was, they were chatting, and Welles sort of ad-libbed the joke, the Fala joke for the president, who loved it, and then kind of a little bit later wrote it with his staff into the speech, and it really worked well. And so, you know, I think there's a story here probably too of just kind of like FDR, of course, understood the power of radio, you know, and that's a big part of the FDR story. But certainly here, I think there's also a story of just the performative side,
narrative,
of being a modern politician.
And a reminder that Hollywood was deeply implicated in U.S. politics from the moment the studio system appeared. So we shouldn't be surprised that presidents and actors and folks who are behind the construction of films are entangled with one another.
Fala died in 1952, the age of 12. He is buried in near the president in Hyde Park. I've been there. I have family right near there, and I've seen those graves. And then, moreover, in D.C., there's a statue of Roosevelt, and Fala is featured beside Roosevelt. I believe the only presidential pet to ever be memorialized in statue form of this kind.
My new project is to get more presidential pets in statue form. No one will tear those down.
Yeah, exactly. Once we tear down all the Confederate statues, what are we going to put back up? Right? Although, you know, then someone's going to be like, oh, you know, Stonewall Jackson had a pet duck, and then it's going to be this whole thing.
It's going to be a thing,
yep.
Didn't we do an episode on pets or like presidential pets or something like
we
that?
We did.
Like the absurdity of like who has what, like.
Oh yeah.
Well, because Teddy Roosevelt, for folks who want to check it out, had a whole menagerie at the White House. So check out that earlier episode on presidential pets.
Yes.
There you go. We'll put the link in the show description. But all right. Well, that brings this to an end. And this is our way of. I like this. The Checkers speech has been on our list for a long time, but I think connecting it to that other Fala speech and realizing there really was a direct connection and inspiration there. And I don't know. The clock's ticking. We were on an 8-year cadence. It's been way too long since someone has used a pet to deflect themselves.
Well, 2012 was a.
Oh, you mean with Romney and his dog? Oh, right. Yeah, he could have maybe deflected that and turned those into jokes, but instead just got sort of up in arms
hammered.
about it. Right? Yeah. But the other thing I was thinking about here is just that obviously politicians have shown personality or whatever, but I just don't think a random story about a dog would no one would even bat an eye now. Politicians. I mean, especially in the Trump era, it's we expect them to just sort of start talking about whatever, and it's just going to be okay, now they're talking about this. Now they're talking about toilets. Now they're talking about the dog. Now they're talking, and so it's just kind of
Wasn't Biden's dog in the news at one point? Did he
Major was a little bitey.
Yeah.
Bitey.
That's what I was like. He bit someone. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, but it's so funny that I guess Biden did try and crack a joke or two out of that, but it's also just it's just such a. You're not going to hold people's attention in this way. You're not going to be able to actually change their mind anymore. And so, even if someone is inspired by these two speeches now, I just don't think our media environment is such that it would actually work.
No.
But yeah. All right. Well, that brings us to the end of the episode. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Send us your dog pictures, folks. Tweet us at the Stay Pod. All right.
Really held myself back from doing a "Who's a good boy? Who's a good boy?"
I am accustomed to hearing malicious falsehoods about myself, but I think I have a right to resent, to object to libelous statements about my dog.
One other thing I probably should tell you, because if I don't, they'll probably be saying this about me too. We did get something, a gift, after the election. A man down in Texas heard Pat on the radio mention the fact that our two youngsters would like to have a dog. You know what it was? It was a little Cocker Spaniel dog in a crate that he'd sent all the way from Texas. Black and white, spotted. And our little girl, Tricia, the 6-year-old, named it Checkers.
Radiotopia.